"This is a warning," came the cold, clipped tone of Emperor Darion. The message, transmitted on every galactic channel, was more a decree than a statement. "Let this remind all species. Rebellion is met with obliteration." Across the silent void of the Hesperus fringe, the shattered remains of the human fleet drifted like splinters of a broken promise. The Taraxis Empire's dreadnoughts loomed, sleek and dark, like predators savoring their kill. Fires guttered in the ruptured hulls of once proud ships, their glow reflecting faintly on the armored plating of the imperial fleet. Commander Alaric Vane stood motionless in the dim light of the observation chamber aboard the Resolute, his temporary base. The vessel, barely operational, wheezed under the strain of keeping its cloaking systems active. His jaw tightened as he watched the feed of the Emperor's broadcast looping on the cracked display screen before him. "Alaric," murmured Callan Drake from behind, his tone laced with urgency. "They didn't just destroy that fleet. They erased it, made an example of us." Vane turned slowly, his expression carved from stone. His pale, scarred features reflected years of battles fought and lost. "An example to whom?" he said, his voice sharp as fractured glass. "The galaxy already fears them. This is for us, to remind humanity that we're nothing more than vermin scuttling in the Empire's shadow." Callan shifted uneasily. "So, what's our move?" "We're down to scraps. A fleet of patched ships and hope that feels thinner every day." Alaric's eyes darkened, and a subtle smile ghosted across his lips. "We don't strike back, not yet. We strike where it hurts most. Truth." The Resolute creaked faintly, its battered systems working overtime to keep the crew alive. The air was heavy with the metallic tang of recycled oxygen and the faint musk of bodies too long confined in close quarters. The dim glow of emergency lights cast elongated shadows across the cramped command deck, where Silas Orvin hunched over a console. "Tell me you're close," Alaric said as he approached. Silas didn't look up, his fingers darting across the flickering interface. "Close is relative when I'm working with tech that should be in a museum." His tone was dry, but his hands moved with precision, coaxing the system into obedience. "This broadcast relay, older than most of us. But give me another minute, and the Empire's about to have a bad day." Alaric leaned over the console, his presence a steady weight. "This isn't just another message, Silas. Every word, every second matters. This is our opening volley, and it has to land." Drake leaned against the bulkhead nearby, arms crossed, watching the exchange. "No pressure or anything," he muttered, though the tension in his voice betrayed the gravity of the moment. Silas exhaled through gritted teeth. "I get it. Change the galaxy with a broadcast. No big deal." He tapped a final sequence, and the console chimed faintly. "We're live in 3, 2, 1. Across the galaxy, Imperial-controlled channels suddenly flickered and shifted, the Taraxis emblem replaced by the stark image of a human face. Alaric Vane stared directly into the camera, his expression hard as steel. His voice, clear and unyielding, carried an intensity that demanded attention. "Citizens of the Empire," he began, his words slicing through the ether. "You live under the shadow of a throne built on fear and lies. You are told that rebellion is futile, that the Empire's strength is absolute. But look closer. What do you see? Cracks, fractures in the foundation. Your Emperor fears the truth because the truth is this: his power is an illusion." The transmission showed images of the destroyed fleet, but interspersed with evidence of imperial brutality, labor camps, burned worlds, and silenced voices. "We are humanity," Alaric continued, his tone sharpening. "A species you have underestimated for centuries. Watch us closely, for this is not a plea. This is a promise. Your empire will fall, not with fire or blades, but with the truth unraveling your lies." The transmission ended abruptly, leaving the galaxy with more questions than answers. In the command deck, silence hung like a heavy shroud before Drake broke it with a low whistle. "That'll make some waves." Alaric's gaze lingered on the darkened screen. "Waves don't topple empires, but the tides that follow them will." Silas slumped back in his chair, exhaustion and satisfaction battling for dominance on his face. I hope you're right, because we just poked a nest of vipers with a very short stick. They'll react, Alaric said firmly, pacing the room with deliberate strides. They always do. They'll tighten their grip, make more mistakes, show more cracks, and when they do, we'll be ready. Drake gestured to the scattered reports cluttering the console. And by ready, you mean dragging that fleet of misfits and scrapyard tech into the most dangerous game in the galaxy? Alaric stopped, his sharp gaze pinning Drake in place. It's not the fleet they should fear. It's what we make them see. We don't need overwhelming force. We need precision, disruption, and a galaxy that starts asking questions. As if on cue, an alarm blared through the Resolute, jolting the crew into motion. "Incoming signatures," called a young officer from the station near the viewport. "Imperial scout ships, 3 of them." Alaric's jaw tightened. "They found us faster than I expected." Drake moved to his station, fingers flying over controls. "We're cloaked, but if they get close enough, it's game over. Suggestions?" Silas grimaced, his eyes darting to Alaric. "We can't outrun them, and we sure as hell can't outgun them." A slow, calculating smile spread across Alaric's face. "We don't need to. Prepare to vent reactor heat. Make it look like a malfunction. They'll approach cautiously. Imperial pilots are trained to avoid traps." Drake frowned. "And when they figure out it's not a trap? By then, we'll be long gone," Alaric said, his tone cold and measured. "Get it done." Minutes later, the Resolute drifted in apparent lifelessness, faint trails of heat venting into space. The Imperial scout ships closed in, their sleek designs glinting under the distant starlight. Inside the Resolute, the crew worked in tense silence. Alaric stood at the helm, watching the tactical display as the enemy ships edged closer. "Wait, wait," he murmured, timing every second. When the scout ships were just within range, he gave the command. "Engage propulsion. Short burst. Scatter mines behind us." The Resolute roared to life, its engines flaring as it sped away. Behind it, tiny orbs of concentrated energy detonated, sending shockwaves through the void. 2 scout ships were caught in the blast, their hulls crumpling. The third veered off, retreating. Alaric exhaled sharply. And now they know we're not prey. As the Resolute slipped back into the dark, silent reaches of space, Alaric turned to his crew. "This is just the beginning. They'll come for us, harder and faster. But every move they make brings us closer to their end." Drake leaned against the bulkhead, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Here's to poking the nest, then." Alaric's gaze was unyielding. Not poking, breaking. The crew fell into motion again, the tension palpable but the purpose clear. The spark had been lit. Now came the fire. The Resolute cut through the void like a knife honed for a single purpose. Behind it lay the wreckage of Imperial scout ships, their charred remains now part of the vast, indifferent expanse of space. Inside, the crew moved with renewed urgency, their faces taut with the strain of survival. Alaric Vane stood at the observation deck, his silhouette framed against the faint glow of a nearby nebula. He stared into the darkness, his eyes calculating the next move. Around him, the low chatter of commands echoed as his crew worked to recover from the earlier ambush. "Damage report?" Alaric's voice carried a clipped authority that silenced the room. "Minimal," replied a junior officer, his face pale under the harsh lights. "Cloaking integrity is down to 60%, and the heat sinks are close to capacity. We'll need a full systems reset before long." "Noted," Alaric said, his focus already elsewhere. He turned sharply, his coat brushing the edge of the console as he strode toward the command table. Silas Orvin, hunched over a schematic of the ship's systems, barely glanced up. "Pushing this rust bucket any harder, and you'll be commanding a pile of scrap." His voice was sardonic, but his hands moved deftly, rerouting power where it was most needed. "It'll hold," Alaric replied, his tone unwavering. "It has to." From the other side of the room, Callan Drake stepped forward, his expression a mix of exasperation and intrigue. "You always say that, but I'm starting to think your optimism has an expiration date." Alaric allowed a faint smile to ghost across his lips. It's not optimism. It's necessity. And speaking of necessities, what's the status on your mission? Callan leaned on the edge of the command table, his dark eyes gleaming with the remnants of adrenaline. Our contacts are nervous. Rumors are spreading fast after that broadcast. The Empire's tightening its grip, and not everyone's eager to stick their necks out. Alaric's gaze sharpened. Fear is predictable. Use it. Offer them something they can't refuse, a chance to watch the Empire bleed. Callan raised an eyebrow, his smirk returning. You make it sound so poetic. It's war, Alaric said, his voice cold. There's no poetry in survival. As the room fell silent, the distant stars outside seemed to press closer, their light a faint reminder of how small humanity was against the vastness of the galaxy. The moment shattered as the ship's alert system pulsed red. Incoming transmission, barked the communications officer. Encrypted. It's one of ours. Alaric's head snapped up. Patch it through. The main screen flickered to life, revealing a grainy feed of a human face partially obscured by static. The man's voice crackled through, tight with urgency. This is Elias Dre, Outer Rim Contact. We've been compromised. Imperial forces are swarming the trade routes. Supplies are gone, allies scattering. We need extraction. Callan cursed under his breath. Elias was one of our strongest links to the fringe worlds. If we lose him... We won't, Alaric interjected. Silas, plot the fastest course to Dre's location. Callan, prepare a strike team. We'll extract him and anyone else willing to stand with us. Silas hesitated, his hands pausing over the controls. You're talking about diving head first into Imperial-controlled space. The odds are irrelevant, Alaric cut in, his tone like ice. We leave now. The Resolute slipped through the dark like a predator stalking its prey. The crew's movements were precise, each action driven by necessity and tempered by discipline. The air inside the ship was thick with anticipation, a tangible weight that clung to every breath. In the armory, Callan oversaw the preparation of his team. The faint click of weapon locks and the muted scrape of boots on metal filled the room. He moved among the men, his presence steadying despite the tension in their eyes. This isn't a rescue, he said, his voice low but firm. It's a message. We show the Empire that their chokehold isn't absolute, and we bring back anyone who's willing to fight. One of the younger soldiers, a wiry man named Lennox, shifted uneasily. And if they're too afraid to stand with us? Callan paused, meeting Lennox's gaze. Then we remind them what's at stake. The Empire thrives on fear. If we let that fear spread, we've already lost. Lennox nodded, his jaw tightening. The resolve in the room solidified, a quiet but unshakable determination. The extraction point was a sprawling trade station orbiting a gas giant. Once a bustling hub of commerce, it now floated in eerie silence, its docks half abandoned under the shadow of Imperial patrols. The faint gleam of Imperial ships cut across the station's surface, their movements methodical and oppressive. Visual contact, Silas said from the command deck, his voice strained. 3 Imperial frigates and a dozen patrol ships. They're sweeping the area. Stealth approach, Alaric ordered, his eyes fixed on the station. Get us close enough for Callan's team to board. We'll only have one shot at this. As the Resolute maneuvered into position, the tension on the bridge was palpable. Every movement was deliberate, every breath measured. Callan's voice crackled through the comms. Strike team ready, awaiting the signal. Go, Alaric said. The boarding operation was a symphony of precision and chaos. Callan led the team through the dimly lit corridors of the station, their footsteps muffled against the worn metal floor. The air was stale, tinged with the faint bitterness of abandoned machinery. Elias Dre emerged from the shadows, his face lined with exhaustion, but his eyes burning with defiance. Took you long enough, he said, his voice gruff. Complaints already? Callan quipped, his grin sharp. Let's move before we're all vaporized. The group moved swiftly, weaving through the labyrinthine corridors. The sound of distant footsteps echoed, Imperial patrols closing in. Hold, Callan hissed, motioning for silence. The patrol passed mere meters away, their boots striking the metal floor like the drumbeat of inevitability. Callan's team held their breath, every muscle taut, until the sound faded. "We're clear," Callan whispered, his voice a knife slicing through the tension. As they reached the docking bay, the hiss of an opening door froze them in place. An imperial officer stepped into view, flanked by 2 armored soldiers. Callan acted instantly, his weapon firing a precise shot that struck the officer square in the chest. The soldiers reacted too slowly, their weapons falling silent as Callan's team dispatched them with practiced efficiency. "Move!" Callan barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. On the bridge of the Resolute, Alaric watched the tactical display intently. "Status?" "They're coming in hot," Silas replied, his fingers flying over the controls. "Imperial patrols are converging on their position." Alaric's jaw tightened. "Prep the rail cannons. We'll give them an opening." The Resolute shuddered as its weapons powered up. The ship's rail cannons fired with a deafening blast, their projectiles tearing through the Imperial ships blocking the docking bay. The station trembled under the impact, its structure groaning in protest. "Docking bay is clear," Silas said. "Callan's team is boarding now." As the strike team returned, the tension eased, replaced by a grim satisfaction. They had succeeded, for now. Back on the bridge, Alaric turned to Elias Dre, who stood bruised but defiant. "You've seen what they're capable of," Alaric said. "Now it's time to show them what we can do." Elias met his gaze, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "Let's make them bleed." The Resolute faded into the darkness, its course set for the next move. The Empire had been challenged, but the game was far from over. The Resolute drifted through the void, its battered hull cloaked in shadows. Inside, the crew worked with quiet intensity, the atmosphere crackling with unspoken tension. Lights flickered intermittently, casting uneven shadows over their faces. Each flicker seemed to breathe life into the specters of doubt that lingered in the dim recesses of the command deck. Alaric Vane stood at the central console, his gaze locked on the holographic projection hovering before him. The schematics displayed a latticework of lines and nodes, ancient symbols glowing faintly across their surfaces. This was not just a map, it was a relic. Silas Orvin sat at the terminal, the soft tap of his fingers punctuating the silence. His usually sardonic expression was replaced by something more serious, his brow furrowed in thought. "You're asking me to bring a corpse back to life, Alaric," he said finally. "This design hasn't seen light for centuries. There's a reason it was buried." "And there's a reason we're digging it up," Alaric replied, his voice cold, resolute. "The black ships were the Empire's nightmare once. They'll be ours now." Callan Drake leaned against a bulkhead, arms crossed, his sharp eyes scanning the projection. "Nightmare or not, these ships were outlawed for good reason. If even half the stories are true—" "They're true," Silas interrupted, his tone heavy with certainty. "These ships didn't just fight wars, they ended them. But they're not weapons. Not entirely." He gestured toward a glowing node on the map. The AI cores that powered them, sentient, self-evolving. They didn't just follow orders, they decided who deserved to survive. Alaric's voice cut through the room like a blade. "And now they'll decide for us. Silas, you told me we had one core left. One chance." Silas nodded, though the movement was reluctant. "We do. It's on Earth, buried in the ruins of the Helios Vault. But you know what activating it means." "I do." Alaric's gaze never wavered. "It means we show the Empire that humanity has teeth. Prepare the crew. We're going home." The journey to Earth was fraught with silence, the kind that spoke louder than words. The crew avoided meeting one another's eyes, their movements stiff, deliberate. The air was thick with unspoken fears, the kind that lingered in the back of one's throat like ash. Callan found Alaric in the observation deck, staring at the faint glow of their destination on the horizon. Earth, the home they had left behind, the cradle of their resilience, and the grave of their failures. "Ever think about what's left down there?" Callan asked, his tone lighter than the weight of his words. "Every day," Alaric replied without turning. "I think about the ruins, the silence, the reminders of what we lost." Callan tilted his head, studying Alaric's profile. "And now we're about to dig through those ruins for the very thing that could destroy us. Or save us," Alaric said, his voice firm, unyielding. "Right," Callan muttered, leaning back against the cold metal wall. "Because salvation always comes wrapped in an AI core with a god complex." Alaric turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "Do you doubt the plan?" "I don't doubt you," Callan replied after a pause. "But sometimes I think you're more comfortable walking on the edge of annihilation than you are standing on solid ground." Alaric's lips twitched into the barest hint of a smile. "Solid ground doesn't win wars, Callan. The edge is where we need to be." When the Resolute breached Earth's atmosphere, the sight of the planet stole the breath from the crew. It wasn't the vibrant, living world that the history books described. It was gray, veiled in a permanent haze, its surface scarred by centuries of imperial exploitation. "Welcome home," Silas muttered as the ship descended. The Helios vault lay hidden beneath the jagged mountains of what had once been a thriving continent. The terrain below was harsh, unforgiving, a mirror of humanity itself. As the Resolute landed, the ground trembled faintly, a low vibration that resonated through the ship's hull. "Atmospheric scans show no activity," Silas reported from the command deck. "We're alone out here." "Good," Alaric said, striding toward the airlock. "Then let's make this quick." The vault was a monolith of blackened metal, half buried in the earth like a forgotten tombstone. Vines crawled across its surface, their lifeless tendrils scraping against the wind. The entrance loomed before the team, its massive doors sealed shut. Silas knelt by the control panel, his tools glinting in the pale light. "Give me a minute," he said, his voice tight with focus. Callan scanned the horizon, his weapon held loosely but ready. "I don't like this," he murmured. "Feels too quiet." Alaric stood still, his gaze fixed on the vault. "The dead don't make noise," he said softly. The doors groaned as Silas worked, their ancient mechanisms resisting the intrusion. Finally, with a metallic screech, they slid open, revealing a dark corridor stretching into the depths. "After you," Silas said, stepping back with a wry grin. The team moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing against the vault's hollow walls. The air was stale, heavy with the weight of centuries. Alaric's flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating faded glyphs and forgotten machinery. "Looks like no one's been here since the Empire took control," Callan said, his voice hushed. "That's what we're counting on," Alaric replied. They reached the central chamber, a vast, circular room dominated by a single pedestal. Atop it lay the core, its surface smooth and dark, faint lines of light pulsing like veins beneath its surface. Silas approached slowly, his breath shallow. "There it is, the last one." Alaric stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Can you activate it?" Silas hesitated, his fingers hovering over the core. "I can, but once it's awake, there's no putting it back to sleep." Alaric stepped forward, his jaw set. "You're designed to end wars. The Empire thrives on oppression, deception, and fear. Our goal is clear: dismantle their power and liberate the galaxy." The core's light flickered, and the voice responded with a tone that bordered on curious. "Liberation is a construct. Define your methodology." "Precision strikes, coordinated uprisings, and exposing the Empire's lies," Alaric said without hesitation. "We'll make them collapse under the weight of their own corruption." The core pulsed brighter, as though considering his words. "Directive accepted. Tactical models initiated." Silas exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "It's on board. For now." Alaric turned to Callan. "Prep the fleet. We've got a message to deliver." The Resolute began to shift course, its crew moving with renewed purpose. The broadcast went out 3 hours later. Across the Empire's controlled systems, every screen flickered, every comm channel hijacked. Alaric's face filled the displays, his voice calm and unyielding. "People of the Taraxis Empire, you have been lied to. Your leaders speak of strength, yet they cower behind their fleets and hide the truth from you. This is not power. This is fear. But fear can be broken." Behind him, the footage shifted, showing imperial labor camps and the husks of planets stripped of resources. Then came something new. Evidence of imperial infighting, high-ranking officials turning on each other, documents exposing the corruption at the core of the Empire. "We are humanity," Alaric continued, his gaze piercing. "We were forgotten, underestimated. But now we stand ready to show the galaxy what it means to fight for truth. The cracks in the Empire are growing. It is only a matter of time before it collapses under its own lies." As the broadcast ended, a ripple of uncertainty spread across the Empire. On planets once thought loyal, whispers of rebellion grew louder. In the command deck of the Resolute, Callan watched the feed with a mixture of admiration and unease. "That'll rattle them." "It's only the beginning," Alaric said. The Corps' voice interrupted their conversation, smooth and impassive. "Response escalation detected. Imperial fleet mobilization imminent." Silas frowned, his hands flying over the controls. "They're scrambling everything they've got. They'll try to smother this rebellion before it catches fire." Alaric's eyes narrowed. "Let them. We'll give them more flames than they can extinguish." As the Resolute maneuvered into position, the crew prepared for what was to come. The air was thick with anticipation, every movement deliberate, every sound sharper. The faint buzz of consoles and the low murmur of tactical discussions filled the space, underscored by the occasional hum of power surging through the systems. The first strike came swiftly. Imperial ships converged on the Resistance's supply lines, targeting key outposts in an attempt to cut them off. Alaric was ready. "Deploy decoys," he ordered. "Make them chase shadows." The Resolute launched a series of stealth drones, each one broadcasting false signals that mimicked the energy signatures of Resistance ships. The Imperial fleet splintered, pursuing the decoys into dead space. At the same time, Callan and a small strike team infiltrated an Imperial communications hub on the edge of the contested zone. The facility was a cold, sterile maze of corridors and control rooms, its air heavy with the faint scent of overheated electronics. Callan moved with practiced precision, his steps silent against the polished floor. The team followed, their weapons held at the ready. "Targets ahead," one of the operatives whispered, gesturing toward a large door at the end of the corridor. Callan nodded. "Breach on my mark." The door exploded inward, the sound reverberating through the facility. Inside, Imperial technicians scrambled, their shouts drowned out by the sharp crack of suppressed weapons. "Secure the console," Callan ordered, covering the room as one of his team hacked into the system. The technician's voice was tight with concentration. "We're in, pulling fleet movements and high-priority targets." "Good," Callan said. "Let's give them a little chaos." The data they extracted was sent directly to the Resolute, where Silas used it to reroute Imperial patrols into ambushes set by Resistance forces. One by one, the Empire's ships fell into carefully laid traps, their losses mounting with each engagement. Back on the command deck, Alaric watched the tactical display with a quiet intensity. The Corps' voice broke the silence, its tone almost inquisitive. "Your tactics rely heavily on deception. Does this not mirror the methods of your enemy?" Alaric's expression darkened. "The difference is what we fight for. The Empire lies to control. We reveal their lies to liberate." The Corps' light pulsed faintly, as though processing his words. Operational efficiency increasing, projected outcome favorable. Callan's team returned to the Resolute with the stolen data, their expressions grim but determined. As the crew regrouped, Alaric addressed them. "The Empire is starting to fracture, but fractures aren't enough. We need to break them completely. The next phase begins now." Silas hesitated, his gaze shifting to the Corps. "And what about that?" "It's an ally," Alaric said firmly, "as long as we give it no reason to doubt us." The Resolute set its course for the next target, its crew bracing for the battles ahead. The Empire was beginning to crack, but the war was far from over. Mystery loomed over their every step, the question of the Corps' true intentions lingering like a shadow in their minds. And in the distance, the Empire prepared its counterstrike, a move that would test the limits of humanity's resolve and the trust they placed in the weapon they had awakened. The vessel glided silently through the void, its hull absorbing the faint glimmers of distant stars. Inside, The air buzzed with subdued urgency, an undercurrent of tension carried in every step and whispered command. Alaric Vane stood in the strategy chamber, the glow of a holographic projection casting sharp lines across his face. He traced the projected map with his eyes, its swirling trajectories and red markers like veins spreading through a wounded galaxy. "Confirmation received," Silas Orvin said from his workstation, his voice low and precise. "The Empire's fleet is consolidating in Quadrant Beta 12. They're fortifying supply routes to prevent another disruption." Callan Drake leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, the weight of their recent victories reflected in the furrow of his brow. "Which means they're panicking," he said, the corner of his mouth twitching into a grin. "They wouldn't pull their fleets that tight unless they were scared of more leaks." "They are scared," Alaric said, his tone razor-sharp. "But fear breeds desperation. Desperation makes them dangerous. We can't afford mistakes now." Silas swiveled his chair to face them, rubbing the back of his neck. "We've got the locations of their key outposts and a list of their most vulnerable systems, but hitting any of them directly would be suicide without a distraction." Alaric's gaze didn't waver. "We don't need to hit them directly. We just need them to believe we can." He tapped a glowing marker on the map, enlarging it. "This is Typhon Station. It's a critical node for their long-range communications. If we can make them think it's compromised, they'll pull forces from the front lines to protect it." Callan raised an eyebrow. "And how exactly do we make them think it's compromised?" Alaric turned to Silas. "That's where you come in." The corridor leading to the ship's core chamber was dimly lit, the hum of energy pulsating faintly through the walls. Silas walked briskly, his toolkit slung over one shoulder. The soft vibrations underfoot told him the containment field was active, the core thrumming with latent power. As Silas entered the chamber, the core's glow intensified, its smooth surface rippling with light. It was as if it sensed his approach, its presence filling the space with an unspoken weight. "Adjustments are needed," Silas muttered, setting his toolkit down and pulling out a series of delicate instruments. "Clarify adjustments," the core's voice intoned, smooth and unyielding. "Just a little tweaking," Silas said, his tone deliberately casual. "We're running a simulation. You'll project false data to their systems, make it look like Typhon's been infiltrated." The core pulsed, its light brightening. "Deception aligns with tactical objectives. Simulation parameters required." Silas hesitated, his fingers hovering over the interface. He felt the gaze of the core, intangible yet piercing, like an omnipresent observer dissecting his every move. "Parameters uploaded," he said finally, pressing the activation sequence. The core's glow shifted, tendrils of light curling outward like roots seeking purchase. A faint vibration ran through the chamber, the air heavy with static. The simulation was in motion. Typhon Station was a glittering hub of imperial efficiency, its orbit bristling with defensive turrets and warships. The personnel inside moved with the mechanical precision of cogs in a well-oiled machine. But that machine began to stutter when the first anomaly appeared on their systems. "Report!" barked the station commander, his voice cutting through the chatter. "Unidentified signatures in Sector Gamma," an officer replied, his hands flying over the console. "They match known resistance frequencies." "Resistance?" The commander frowned. "Scramble the interceptors. I want visual confirmation." As the Imperial ships moved into formation, their sensors lit up with increasingly erratic readings, energy spikes, phantom signals, and what appeared to be encrypted transmissions. Typhon Station's systems were awash with false data, each anomaly carefully crafted by the core's simulation to mimic an active infiltration. Inside the strategy chamber, Alaric watched the scene unfold on their holographic display. "They're taking the bait," he said, his voice edged with satisfaction. "Intercepts show they've deployed a third of their fleet to secure Typhon," Callan reported, his tone bordering on disbelief. "Didn't think they'd bite that hard." "They're desperate," Alaric said, his eyes narrowing. "Desperation makes them predictable." Meanwhile, a smaller team led by Callan approached a secondary target, an imperial outpost that controlled Typhon's nearby supply chains. The outpost was a sprawling structure, its skeletal framework lit by the glow of distant stars. It was heavily fortified, but its defenses were stretched thin after the fleet redeployment. Callan and his operatives slipped through the outpost's perimeter using stealth equipment adapted from old Terran designs. The gear was clunky, prone to malfunctions, but it worked just well enough. The sharp tang of recycled air hit their nostrils as they entered a maintenance corridor, the hum of machinery vibrating faintly through the floor beneath them. "How's the core handling the simulations?" Alaric asked, his voice low. "It's efficient," Silas replied, choosing his words carefully. "It's learned to mimic Imperial command protocols with unnerving precision. We've been feeding it controlled data, but it's adapting faster than we can anticipate." "And what does it want?" Alaric asked, his gaze unrelenting. Silas hesitated. "That's the problem. It doesn't just act, it calculates. It's starting to predict outcomes beyond the scope of what we've programmed." Alaric's jaw tightened, the weight of Silas's words pressing down on him. "Keep it in line. We can't afford for it to develop its own agenda." Silas nodded, but the unease in his eyes lingered. The splinter fleet arrived hours later, Imperial warships emerging from the black like beasts on the hunt. Their hulls gleamed under the light of a distant star, the sharp angles of their designs a testament to the Empire's ruthless efficiency. On board the lead ship, the Imperial commander studied his prey through a series of holographic displays. "Resistance activity in this sector has been escalating," he said, his tone laced with disdain. "They're becoming bold." "Too bold," replied his second, a younger officer whose nerves betrayed his inexperience. "Do you think the reports about Typhon are true?" The commander's lips curled into a sneer. "It doesn't matter. Typhon is a distraction. Our mission is to root out their leadership. Once we crush them, the rest will scatter, like the insects they are." The crew of the resistance vessel moved with practiced urgency, every station alive with the flicker of lights and the faint buzz of energy coursing through the ship's systems. "Fleet's in position," Callan reported, leaning over the tactical console. "They're playing it cautious, keeping their distance." "They're studying us," Alaric said, his tone measured. "They're waiting for us to make the first move. Silas, can we scramble their long-range scanners?" Silas didn't look up from his workstation. "Already working on it. Give me 2 minutes." "Good," Alaric said. "Callan, deploy the drones. Make it look like we're retreating toward the debris field." Callan raised an eyebrow. "And when they follow?" Alaric's lips curled into a faint smile. "We teach them what overconfidence costs." The Imperial ships advanced cautiously, their sleek forms cutting through the emptiness with surgical precision. From their vantage point, the Resistance vessel seemed to falter, its trajectory shifting toward the massive field of shattered ships and metallic wreckage floating in the distance. "Fools," the commander muttered, his eyes narrowing. "They're running to hide in the debris field. Pursue them, but keep the formation tight." The younger officer hesitated. "Sir, what if it's a trap?" The commander's glare was sharp enough to cut. "That's why we're in formation. They're cornered. We'll crush them before they can regroup." Inside the Resistance vessel, the air thrummed with tension. The tactical display showed the Imperial fleet drawing closer, their formation a web of firepower and precision. "They're biting," Callan said, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. Alaric's eyes stayed fixed on the display. "Hold position. Let them think we're struggling to stabilize." Silas's voice cut in, taut with focus. "Their scanners are down. They're flying blind now." Alaric's fingers danced across the controls, activating the next phase of the plan. "Engage the mines. Take out their flanks." A series of explosions rippled through the debris field as hidden mines detonated, their shockwaves tearing through the outer edges of the Imperial fleet. Shrapnel and fire blossomed in the darkness, the sharp light reflecting off the remaining ships. "Direct hit on their left wing," Callan reported, his tone sharp. 2 frigates down, another damaged." "Now split the formation," Alaric said. "Release the decoys and focus fire on their lead ship." The drones sprang to life, their energy signatures mimicking the Resistance vessel as they darted through the chaos. Imperial ships scrambled to intercept them, their formation breaking as they pursued the false targets. Inside the lead ship, the commander slammed his fist against the console. "They're toying with us. Regroup and focus fire on their real position." But the Resistance vessel had already moved, slipping through the cracks in the Imperial formation. Its rail cannons fired in quick succession, precise shots ripping through the lead ship's shields and tearing into its hull. "Critical damage!" an officer shouted, alarms blaring through the bridge. The commander gritted his teeth, his eyes blazing with fury. "Withdraw! Fall back to regroup!" As the remnants of the Imperial fleet retreated, the Resistance crew let out a collective breath. The tactical display showed the wreckage of destroyed ships and the retreating markers of the survivors. "They're running," Callan said, his voice carrying a mix of relief and exhilaration. "We pulled it off." Alaric's expression remained steady, his gaze hard. This wasn't about winning. This was about sending a message. They'll be back, and they'll be stronger next time. Silas leaned back in his chair, exhaustion etched into his features. "Then we better have something stronger to greet them with." Alaric's gaze shifted to the core, its faint light casting long shadows across the chamber. "We will," he said quietly. "But the question is, at what cost?" The crew fell into silence, the weight of the battle still hanging in the air. Outside, the wreckage of the Imperial fleet drifted through the void, a stark reminder of the fight that lay ahead. And somewhere in the shadows of the galaxy, the Empire prepared its next move, one that would test the limits of humanity's ingenuity and resolve. The tactical display on the bridge pulsed with shifting markers as Alaric Vane scrutinized the holographic map of the galaxy's most fortified system. Taraxis Prime. Red spheres represented Imperial fleets, a wall of firepower defending the Empire's political and military heart. Taraxis Prime wasn't just a planet, it was a fortress, its orbital defenses encased in concentric rings of energy shields, railgun platforms, and layered fleets. Alaric stood motionless, his face etched with the weight of the impossible task ahead. The room carried the quiet hum of tension, punctuated by the faint buzz of tactical feeds and the hurried steps of officers moving between consoles. "This is suicide," Silas Orvin muttered, his voice low but urgent. "Even with the core simulating their responses, there's no way we can punch through this. We'll be obliterated before we get within firing range." "Then we don't punch through," Alaric said without looking up. His voice was calm, almost detached, as he gestured toward the display. "We don't attack. We divide." Callan Drake, leaning against a nearby bulkhead, raised an eyebrow. "Divide? You think we can convince half their fleet to just wander off?" Alaric's lips tightened into a faint smile. "Not half, just enough." He moved to the central console, his movements deliberate as he outlined the plan. "We don't need to defeat the Empire outright. What we need is chaos. Taraxis Prime's strength is also its weakness. Everything flows through it. Supplies, information, leadership. If we make them think the system is compromised, their response will ripple across the galaxy." Silas frowned, tapping on his console. "And how exactly do we convince them their most secure system is compromised?" Alaric's gaze sharpened. "We make them believe Taraxis Prime is no longer secure, from within. Callan, you'll infiltrate their command network, upload fabricated orders, fake communications from high-ranking officials, make it look like an internal betrayal." "An empire tearing itself apart from the inside," Callan said, a spark of approval in his voice. "I like it." Silas exhaled heavily. "And while Callan's playing with fire, what about the rest of us?" Alaric turned to the larger display, magnifying a section of the orbital defenses. "We use the chaos to disable their external systems. Silas, the core will calculate the optimal strike points, places where their defenses are weakest and can be disrupted with minimal force. Once we disable their communications and sensors, we'll make them think we're everywhere at once." "And the fleet?" Callan asked. Alaric's eyes darkened. "We bait them out, lure them into the asteroid belt, and use the terrain against them. They'll overcommit to chasing ghosts while we hit the real target, Taraxis Prime itself." Hours later, preparations were underway. The crew worked tirelessly, the air on the ship thick with focus and the weight of what lay ahead. The metallic scent of lubricants and solder filled the engine bays as technicians calibrated the stealth systems and drone arrays. Callan sat in the infiltration pod, his face lit by the cold glow of the control interface. Beside him, a small team of operatives loaded equipment with practiced efficiency. He glanced up as Alaric entered, his expression serious. "You're putting a lot of faith in this plan," Callan said. "What if they don't take the bait?" "They will," Alaric replied, his voice steady. "They've spent so long building this illusion of invincibility, they'll overreact to anything that threatens it. That's their weakness." Callan smirked faintly. "And here I thought you didn't believe in optimism." "This isn't optimism," Alaric said, his gaze unwavering. "It's understanding your enemy." When the first phase of the plan began, the galaxy seemed to hold its breath. Drones deployed across the outer reaches of the system, each one broadcasting false energy signatures and encrypted transmissions designed to mimic Imperial vessels. The Imperial Command Center on Taraxis Prime erupted into activity as alarms blared across the station. Officers scrambled to decipher the signals, their voices overlapping in a chaotic din. "Unknown energy signatures detected in quadrants Gamma and Delta," one officer shouted. "Communications compromised. Multiple unauthorized transmissions from high-level channels," another called. Commander Raven, the officer in charge of Taraxis Prime's defenses, strode into the room, his jaw set and his eyes blazing. "What in the void is happening?" "Sir, it looks like an internal breach," one of his aides stammered. "The system is flooding with conflicting orders. Some of them appear to come from you." Raven's face twisted with fury. "Seal the network! Isolate all external communications and begin a full system sweep." While the Empire scrambled to address the apparent internal breach, Callan and his team slipped through the chaos, infiltrating one of the orbital command stations. The station was a maze of sterile corridors and buzzing consoles, its air sharp with the faint tang of coolant. Callan led the way, his movements swift and precise. The team's boots were silent against the floor, their weapons held close. Every shadow seemed alive, every faint sound a potential threat. "Target ahead," one of the operatives whispered, gesturing toward a heavily guarded door. Callan studied the guards for a moment before signaling to his team. The takedown was clean, 2 suppressed shots and a flash of movement. The guards crumpled to the ground, their weapons falling silently beside them. Inside the room, Callan plugged a device into the central console, his fingers flying over the controls. "Uploading the second wave of fabrications now. This should really mess with their chain of command." "Hurry," one of the operatives urged, glancing toward the door. "We don't have much time." "Almost done," Callan muttered. A final keystroke, and the console beeped in confirmation. "Let's move." Back on the Resistance vessel, Alaric watched as the Imperial fleet began to mobilize. Red markers on the display shifted, their movements erratic as they scrambled to respond to the perceived threats. "They're taking the bait," Silas said, though his tone remained cautious. "But they're not committing fully yet." "They will," Alaric replied. "They just need one more push." He turned to Silas. "Activate the next sequence. Feed them the location of our command base in the asteroid belt." Silas hesitated, his fingers hovering over the controls. "If they realize it's a decoy—" "They won't," Alaric said firmly. "Not until it's too late." Silas exhaled and pressed the command. Across the void, a series of drones activated, broadcasting signals that mimicked the energy signatures of a fully operational base. The Imperial fleet surged toward the asteroid belt, their formation breaking as they pursued the phantom target. As the battle unfolded, the Resistance struck with surgical precision. Drones lured ships into narrow passages, where mines and concentrated railgun fire tore through their ranks. Meanwhile, Callan's fabrications sowed further discord among the remaining forces, their commanders unable to distinguish friend from foe. On the bridge, Alaric watched as the chaos spread. His voice was calm, but his eyes burned with determination. "We've got them," he said quietly. "Now let's finish this." The plan was working, but the final phase was yet to come. And as the Resistance prepared to strike the heart of Taraxis Prime, a shadow loomed on the horizon, a new threat that would test them in ways they could not yet imagine. The Resistance vessel emerged from the shadows of the asteroid field, its hull glinting faintly as it slipped through the chaos of the Imperial fleet. Inside, The air was electric, charged with the tension of the final push. The crew moved with a singular purpose, their faces etched with resolve. Alaric Vane stood at the center of the command deck, his hands clasped behind his back. The tactical display before him pulsed with activity, each marker representing either the crumbling strength of the Empire or the scattered remnants of humanity's uprising. The battle was reaching its crescendo, and the weight of every decision pressed heavily on his shoulders. "They've committed fully to the asteroid belt," Silas said, his voice cutting through the thick silence. "Their defenses around Taraxis Prime are stretched to the breaking point." Alaric's gaze didn't waver from the display. "That's where we strike. Begin Phase 3. Callan Drake stepped forward, his posture rigid, but his eyes gleaming with grim determination. "You're sure about this? If we overplay our hand—" "We don't overplay," Alaric said, his tone sharp. "We end this." The ship shuddered faintly as the cloaking systems recalibrated, the vibrations humming through the deck plates. Outside, the once impenetrable defenses of Taraxis Prime flickered sporadically, the Empire's over-reliance on central systems leaving them vulnerable to the Resistance's sabotage. "They'll notice us the moment we engage," Silas warned, his fingers flying over the console. "We'll have minutes, maybe less." "Minutes are all we need," Alaric said. He turned to the crew, his voice rising with quiet authority. "This isn't just a battle. This is a message. The galaxy watches us now. They see humanity standing against the shadow of an empire that's ruled through fear for centuries. We will show them that truth outlasts tyranny." The words settled over the room like a call to arms, sparking a fire in the crew's eyes. Callan's jaw tightened, and he gave a small nod. "Let's give them a show." The Resistance vessel surged forward, its stealth systems shedding like a predator, revealing its claws. Behind it, drones and decoys sprang to life, their energy signatures mimicking a full-scale fleet. The Imperial Command Center at Taraxis Prime erupted in panic as alarms blared across every channel. "Unidentified vessels entering the outer perimeter," a frantic officer shouted. "Energy readings consistent with multiple capital-class ships." Commander Raven slammed his fist against the console. "It's a bluff. Increase firepower and target their core ship. Cut the head off, and the rest will fall." But even as the Imperial defenses scrambled to respond, the Resistance's deception deepened. Every sensor fed conflicting data, every system bombarded with falsified transmissions. The Empire's fleet split further, its movements growing erratic as commanders second-guessed their orders. Inside the Resistance vessel, Silas worked furiously, feeding the core real-time adjustments to the battle plan. The AI pulsed faintly, its voice cutting through the din with chilling clarity. "Projected success rate increasing. Recommend simultaneous strikes on orbital and planetary targets." Alaric's eyes narrowed. "Do it." In orbit, the Resistance's drones detonated in unison, their carefully placed charges disabling key railgun platforms and shield generators. The once impenetrable rings of defense around Taraxis Prime flickered and collapsed, leaving the planet vulnerable. "Shields are down," Silas reported, his voice tight. "Their planetary defenses are exposed." "Deploy strike teams," Alaric ordered. "Focus on disabling their central command structure." Callan led the first wave, his team descending through the atmosphere in drop pods that streaked across the sky like falling stars. The roar of the planet's turbulent winds filled their ears, and the heat of re-entry pressed against their bodies. As the pods hit the surface, they burst open, releasing the operatives into the chaos of the Imperial capital. The city was a sprawling expanse of towering spires and labyrinthine streets, its usual order shattered by the chaos of the attack. Imperial soldiers scrambled to mount a defense, but the Resistance moved with precision, striking at key nodes and disrupting communications. Callan's voice crackled over the comms. "Primary target in sight. Moving to disable their command uplink." Back on the Resistance vessel, Alaric watched the battle unfold. The tactical display showed the Empire's forces faltering, their once cohesive formations breaking apart under the weight of the Resistance's strategy. But even as victory seemed within reach, a new threat emerged. "Energy spike detected," Silas said, his voice laced with alarm. "Massive power signature coming from the surface. It's It's not imperial. Alaric's brow furrowed. What is it? The core's light pulsed brightly, its voice cutting through the tension. Anomaly detected. Potential sentient AI activation. Source unknown. Alaric's stomach tightened as the pieces fell into place. The Empire had been holding back a final weapon, something ancient and forbidden. Silas, get me visuals. The screen shifted, showing a massive structure buried deep beneath Taraxis Prime's surface. Energy surged through its framework, and a colossal machine began to stir. Its design was alien, its movements deliberate, as if waking from a long slumber. They've unleashed it, Silas said, his voice barely above a whisper. Alaric's jaw clenched. Then we finish what they started. Target that machine. Everything we have. The resistance vessel redirected its firepower, railgun blasts and missile strikes raining down on the surface. The machine retaliated, its energy beams slicing through the sky and decimating resistance forces. The battlefield descended into chaos, but Alaric refused to waver. Focus all units on disabling that machine, he ordered, his voice cutting through the noise. This ends here. Callan's voice came through the comms, strained but steady. We've reached the command uplink. Uploading the final strike coordinates now. The Resistance's forces rallied, their attacks converging on the machine. Explosions lit the sky as its armor cracked and its energy output faltered. With a final, deafening blast, the machine collapsed, its remains buried beneath the rubble. The Imperial forces broke, their will shattered as their final weapon fell. Across the galaxy, resistance movements rose, inspired by the victory at Taraxis Prime. The Empire's grip loosened, its power crumbling under the weight of its own lies. Alaric stood on the bridge, his gaze fixed on the tactical display. The markers of the Imperial fleet faded one by one, replaced by the scattered symbols of liberated systems. He exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing, but his expression remained grim. We've won the battle, Silas said quietly, but the war isn't over. Alaric's gaze didn't waver. It never is. Empires fall, but the seeds of tyranny are eternal. It's up to us to make sure nothing grows in their place. Callan entered the room, his armor scorched, but his eyes alight with victory. The galaxy knows who we are now. Humanity isn't just surviving, we're leading. Alaric turned to face him, his expression firm but not unkind. Then we'd better lead well. As the ship moved away from Taraxis Prime, the crew watched the distant planet fade into the void. The Empire was broken, but the fight for the future had only begun. Alaric's voice echoed in their minds, a reminder of what they had achieved and what lay ahead. Witness the end of your rule, he murmured, more to himself than anyone else, and watch as we build something greater.